This is one of the earliest fragments of film of London, shot in 1896. News cameramen in those early days dashed to record all kinds of events, and thanks to them and their hand-operated cameras, we do have coverage of some aspects of history in the early 20th century. Here, an early camera photographs holiday crowds while the men delighting, clowning for this strange new contraption. The women in the picture seemed more passive, more subdued. In the 1890s, what was their role in society? Women then? They were expected, of course, to be feminine, the very little talk of the equality of sexy. To be feminine was to be inferior, held back by a wall of masculine prejudice and a great mass of social restrictions. This compilation of archive film shows early newsreels of the sometimes violent campaign for women's rights. It also records some of the more gradual technological and social advancements which help reshape ideas and attitudes. And it looks at the new lives and new freedoms won by women. By the end of the 20s in Victorian England, upper-class women were bound by marriage vows, corsets, and a strict, inescapable etiquette. Lower-class women, usually servants or factory girls, had been tied for centuries to a life of ill-paid drudgery in the so-called sweated industries. They suffered miserably, making endless sacks for throat and a dozen or piles of matchboxes 7 days a week. By the end of the century, a breath of fresh air had entered the lives of more fortunate women. Cycling out to the country was allowed. Married women had the right to their own property. A very few women had managed to break into medicine, and wealthier women could vote, but only in local government. The women's movement had begun during Victoria's reign, but she herself had always been opposed to this mad, wicked folly of women's rights. With the passing of the Queen, the Victorian age was dead, but Victorian attitudes continued. My family's acquaintances were quite horrified by the news that I wanted to go to the university, but in those days a girl who trained her mind was still thought to be endangering her matrimonial prospects. I never approved of ruin having to vote, and I always felt that when women began to call themselves equal with men that they'd step down into the arena. These attitudes were typical and often encountered in the long campaign by Mrs. Fawcett for the parliamentary vote. The policy of her suffragists was peaceful negotiation by constitutional means, while the more notorious Mrs. Pankhurst and her suffragettes pursued a policy of deeds, not words, protest through militant action. This is Mrs. Pankhurst on the right, photographed during the First World War in a rare piece of film of the suffragette leaders. On the right now is Mrs. Drummond, the general. The next woman is unknown, and on the left is Mrs. Pankhurst's daughter Christabel. Back in 1908, Christabel had outlined the militant policy. Militant strategists who formed women's social and political unions are engaged in the attempt to win the parliamentary vote for the women of this country. For 40 years, this reasonable claim has been laid before Parliament. Meetings have been held, and sufficient signs that failure has been the result. The reason of this failure is that women have not been able to bring pressure to bear upon the government, and government moves only in response to pressure. We have waited too long for political justice. We refuse to wait any longer. There is no film of suffrage agitation until this constitutional demonstration of 1910. Newsreel cameramen obviously found this more easy to film than secret attacks by militants. Yet militancy had forced the issue into public debate, and in 1910 a bill was introduced to give richer women the parliamentary vote. Mrs. Fawcett's suffragists had been able to organize an impressive amount of male support. In June, 10 constitutionalists and militants marched in triumph, believing the government was at last giving way in a huge, brilliantly organized parade. Over 600 militants dressed in white held arrows proudly aloft as a symbol of their imprisonment for the cause. Many had endured hunger strikes and forced feeding. In the midst of her faithful followers marched Mrs. Pankhurst. The Morning Post observed it was the most striking exhibition of faith and strength, and during its progress probably won for their cause far more supporters than a whole series of disorderly assemblies in Parliament Square. One of the slogans emphasized a point made by Christabel in 1908. The British Constitution provides the taxation and representation shall go together. Therefore, women taxpayers are entitled to dope. But the government disagreed. The bill was shelved. Suffragettes almost immediately resumed their tactics of pressure through militancy, but the police had orders to delay arrests. Wave after wave of women, some of whom carried placards, were punched, knocked down, and trampled on. The vote symbolized the whole women's movement towards emancipation and was a rallying point for their struggle against injustices in all walks of life. The drudgery and donkey work that women had to endure in industry. This coal mine was filmed in 1910, was for long hours, much less pay than men, and often under grueling conditions. One of the strongest supporters of women's rights was the father of the Labor Party. Here Hardy, a colleague, recalled his socialism with a great human conception of the equal rights of all men and women to the wealth of the world and to the enjoyment of the fullness of life. And another ardent socialist supporter was George Lansbury. But his idealism in this 1912 election was ill-rewarded by the all-male voters. He lost his seat and later even went to prison for his suffragette sympathies. This demonstration, demanding his release, was organized by another of Mrs. Pankhurst's daughters, Sylvia. In contrast to the rest of her family, who mainly campaigned among more affluent sections of society, Sylvia worked among the poor of London's East End. As in so many other suffragette demonstrations, the marchers clashed with the police and there were the inevitable arrests. This important and lavish pageant came just before King George's coronation in 1911. Now the ex-prisoners numbered almost 1,000. Effective propaganda was helping to change people's traditional ideas about a woman's place, and the old image was fading before the exciting and newsworthy independence of the new woman. The new woman was emerging against a background of considerable social upheaval. Spirit of the age was valid and tempestuous not only because of the struggle between peers and commons. They were the suffragettes, and in industry there was a wave of strikes and lockouts and great bitterness between employers and employed in the 3 years before the war. Votes for women was just one problem in the general crisis facing the government. Suffragettes were infuriated by the wait-and-see policy of Asquith, the Prime Minister. Militancy reached its peak of violence. No property was safe from their arson attacks at all times. Mrs. Pankhurst was adamant in her ruling that our militancy be against property only, at no time endangering human life. Fortunately, there never was any loss of life in the dozens of buildings the suffragettes destroyed all around the country. And on Thursday I was called up very early in the morning to come down and watch the pier fall into the sea. The suffragettes had put a bomb in the dressing room, and the place was totally destroyed. I never thought my show was as bad as all that. That was not a good year. Such action undoubtedly alienated public sympathy. Yet the militants might reply, where had peaceful constitutional action got them? But of all the suffragette outrages, the most sensational came at the 1913. For the police, it was going to be just another day of controlling the crowds. But somewhere in those crowds, as the King's carriage arrived, was a suffragette called Emily Davison. During one of her 9 imprisonments for militant protest, it was said that she had attempted suicide. As the race began, Emily stood waiting at Tottenham Corner. When the horses thundered around the corner, Emily ducked under the rail, darted among the riders and waited to be crushed by the King's horse. The jockey was not badly hurt, but Emily Davison died 5 days later. Here is the incident again in slow motion. Outside the church, St. George's, Bloomsbury. The police had to hold back the huge crowds, and at Morpeth, where she was taken to be buried, there are again thousands of spectators. All the newsreels covered the sensation. But why, people wondered, had she done it? Well, she was very religious, and she had the idea that every movement must have sacrifice. This strange procession in May 1914 was advertising the Suffragette magazine. Its front page reads, "Arrest Bon-A-Law in Carson." Carson, supported by Bon-A-Law, was leading the Unionists in Ireland who were openly resisting the government's Home Rule policy. Suffragettes petitioned Carson on his doorstep. Why should men be allowed to act illegally over the Irish question? When women were hounded and imprisoned over the suffrage question. It was yet another case of discrimination against women. This newsreel, also from May 1914, showed what it hoped was a change of heart by the militants, and as there were over 3,000 cinemas, a good many people saw the film of this cheerful procession. It was the climax of a week of bazaars and exhibitions, and the suffragettes could well afford to be cheerful, with funds for that year totaling £37,000. This newsreel title stresses that these are law-abiding suffragists, members of Mrs. Fawcett's non-militant National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. But despite all the peaceful marches, despite all the militant protest, by 1914 women still seemed no nearer the vote. A desperate attempt to enlist the king's support for the cause ended only in more arrests. What had militancy achieved? It proved that the body of women were ready to break with the long tradition of decorum in which women had been bred for generations. The militant movement gave a violent jolt to some of the traditional ideas concerning the nature of women. But it took another really massive jolt to create the sort of opportunities and freedoms that women have been demanding for so many years. On August 4, 1914, war was declared. Mrs. Pankhurst immediately called a halt to militancy. Well, she and Mrs. Fawcett turned their organizations towards the war effort. Christabel Pankhurst returned from exile in Paris and demanded new policies of food rationing and women's war work. The British lion is awake. So is the lioness. Women were determined to play their part in the war ahead. One obvious way to help was recruiting. Here, an American actress puts her charms into effective use. "Oh, we don't want to lose you, but we think you ought to go for your king and your country both need you." So another obvious role for women was nursing. Since Florence Nightingale revolutionized the treatment of the wounded in the Crimean War, nursing had become one of the few jobs a respectable girl was allowed to do. When Nurse Cavell was executed in 1915, Asquith admitted there are thousands of such women, but a year ago we did not know it. Before long, very often without the approval of their menfolk, women were being recruited into the auxiliary services. These volunteers were filmed in Trafalgar Square, eager to be useful and to escape the boring routine of a woman's existence. This government propaganda film of 1918 dramatizes the beginning of the war as it affected a typical middle-class family. Though when it happened in reality, the working of the spirit was perfectly serious. To organize this procession, in July 1915, Mrs. Pankhurst had received £2,000 from her old enemy, Lloyd George, who was anxious to recruit women into his munitions factories. Not even the pouring rain could dampen the enthusiasm of the thousands of women determined to be useful. The huge banner proclaimed their purpose: "We demand the right to serve procession to the munitions ministry." One group of women who'd successfully mobilized themselves was the Scottish Women's Hospitals, founded by Dr. Elsie Ingalls. This film shows one of her units in France. But when she'd offered her services to the War Office in March 1915, she was told, "My good lady, go home and sit still." But with an independence and determination that characterized the new women, and with backing from the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, she just went. And her services were invaluable. Elsie Ingalls once said, "The ordinary male disbelief in our capacity cannot be argued away. It can only be worked away." Meanwhile, the campaign to get women enrolled into the munitions industries have been highly successful. Many came from domestic service, but probably more were middle-class girls with no previous experience of working. I've never been in a factory before and a friend and I thought to ourselves, well, let's do something. Every volunteer had to pass a medical examination. The National Health Service was still a long way off, but here was a real stimulus to basic health provision, and with such dangerous work, the girls needed it. We filled them with TNTCE, competition, explosive and detonators, and we were paid a little bit more for that. Our ordinary wage was 25 shillings. With such vital work, their welfare was doubly important compared to the dreadful conditions of women coal miners a few years before. They received excellent attention. Employers were beginning to see the connection between welfare and productivity. Improvements like proper washroom facilities and good canteens were to have a lasting effect on factory conditions. Well-organized day nurseries were another important innovation, giving working mothers the confidence to leave their children under proper supervision. Child welfare was also vital to the nation, losing thousands of its men every week in the trenches. As well as dangerous work, the women took on highly skilled work. It had always been argued they would be incapable. Yet despite fierce opposition from male trade unionists, they proved their capability in all kinds of jobs. Thanks for watching in this video. Please like and subscribe my YouTube channel.